I'm going to start by showing you this hard drive that I have in my system. This particular model is a Seagate drive, the 1TB model. This drive is actually getting quite a bit old now, and its health status is quite bad last time I checked in Crystal Disk Info. This is the drive I mainly use to store my games and other documents. Next, I'm going to move on to where I store the programs which I use the most, and my operating system. I choose to store these things on this SSD because it's extremely fast. For example, it allows my computer to go from completely off to my desktop in about 10 seconds. It also makes searching my drive faster. The reason this type of solid state storage is so fast is because it uses NAND flash chips instead of moving parts like disks and tracking heads. This type of device uses less power than a typical hard drive and typically lasts longer. One downside to using an SSD is that storage per pound is significantly lower than that of a hard drive. This 120GB SSD cost me £20, whereas a 120GB hard drive could probably be salvaged from an old Skybox for less than £5. Both of my drives use the SATA interface, and you can see here the longer connector on the drive is for power, which connects directly to the power supply, and the shorter connector is for data, which connects through one of these cables to the motherboard. The connector is the same on both ends and is reversible. Older drives use a variety of different interfaces, but the most commonly used is IDE, but any drives made in the last sort of 8 or 9 years won't use this interface because it's outdated. The next thing I'm going to move on to is Intel Optane. Intel Optane is very different to a normal hard drive or SATA SSD. It connects to the motherboard through an NVMe interface which is located directly on the motherboard. My motherboard sadly doesn't have this type of connector, but you can see here what it would look like if I did have one. Intel Optane is a very low capacity drive with extremely low latency, which is the delay before the drive acts on an instruction, and this has the aim of speeding up all the other drives in your system. Other types of SSD are NVMe and M.2. M.2 SSDs connect to the motherboard in a similar way to NVMe, but NVMe gains a speed advantage due to interfacing through the PCIe bus, whereas M.2 still uses SATA. Next, I'm going to be moving on to talking about the central processing unit, or the CPU. My CPU is an Intel i5-2400 and it's about 7 years old now, but it still holds up completely fine for what I need it for. The CPU is the unit that controls all the other components in the system and performs vital calculations. My CPU has 4 cores, which is the most common number of cores for a consumer. Cores dictate the size of the workload that the CPU can handle at one time. For 4 cores, the CPU should technically be able to handle 4 programs running at once, but it isn't always this clear cut. This processor has a turbo frequency of 3.3 GHz. It's also a fairly standard number. Newer CPUs can boost higher, but this is the sort of number that I'm comfortable with. Intel and AMD, the two main players in the CPU market, operate using different sockets. As CPU technology has advanced, the way in which the CPU interfaces with the motherboard has also changed. Traditionally, Intel has used a land grid array, or LGA, interface on their CPUs, which means that the pins that connect to the CPU are located on the motherboard, whereas AMD uses a pin grid array, or PGA, interface. If pins on the motherboard bend and render the socket useless, this is typically a cheaper fix than replacing an entire CPU. It can also be considered easier to bend pins accidentally that are attached to a CPU by dropping it. As well as providing vital calculations to the system, some CPUs are tasked with delivering graphical displays for systems that do not have a dedicated graphics card. In Intel's case, these are called iGPUs, or Integrated Graphics Processing Units. These are also extremely basic and are not capable of running modern games due to limited die space and lack of VRAM. In AMD's case, they're APUs, or Accelerated Processing Units, favour higher performance graphically and can be used as a substitute for a dedicated graphics card in some modern games. Moving on to RAM, things are a little easier to understand from a beginner point of view. RAM stands for Random Access Memory, which means the programs running on your PC can request to access the space on the chips in order to run. A good amount of RAM to start with in a basic system is 4GB. Windows usually uses no more than around 2GB at a time, and this leaves headroom for famously RAM-hungry programs like Google Chrome. I have 10 gigs of RAM in my system because workload typically requires higher amounts of RAM. Next, the power supply unit. The most common power supply type is ATX. You can tell a power supply unit is ATX because they typically have one 24-pin connector and a 4/8-pin connector. They also commonly have SATA cables and also 6 to 8-pin GPU power connectors. The main role of the power supply is to supply the correct current to all the different components within the system. Last of all, I'm going to talk about the most important component in the system. The motherboard has many roles, but simply speaking it just provides a platform for all the components to communicate with each other. At the top left of the board is the I/O, including USB ports, SPDIF ports, and Ethernet ports and audio jacks. Going down the board you can find the CPU fan header, the CPU socket, then the RAM slots, 24-pin and 4/8-pin CPU power connectors, PCIe PCI slots, the RAM slots and the NVMe slots including SATA ports, and the front panel headers including USB. One of the main functions of the motherboard is to provide a BIOS, or basic input-output system, which tests all the components are in working order before the system powers on. Now, here comes the fun part. Now we have to put the computer together. So what you're going to do here is first of all put your motherboard on a non-conductive surface. If you have it, the box is perfect for this, but I'm just going to put it down on the table. Now you're going to want to grab the mounting hardware for your CPU cooler and install that first. For me, this just involves putting a bracket through the holes around my socket from the back of the board, but if you're not using this cooler it might be a bit different, but the general principle is the same. Oh, and while the box is out, it's a good idea to insert the I/O shield into the hole in the case. To do this, make sure the I/O shield is the right side up and carefully push against the slot until you hear a click. This step is really important to do, otherwise you're at risk of forgetting to do it further down the line like I did earlier. Next comes the most dangerous part of the whole build. Take your CPU and make sure the triangle in the corner of the PCB lines up with the triangle on the corner of your socket. Gently line the triangles up on the CPU and the socket. Gently lower the CPU into place, then give it a little wiggle and make sure it's seated correctly. Lower the bracket and then bring down the retention arm. This may be quite tight, but that's normal. Push the retention clip into place and you're good to go. Now for the RAM. Take the sticks and see which side of the gap is the longest. Line the gap up with the gap on your RAM slot and open the tabs on the slot. Insert the RAM into the slot. If you've lined the RAM up correctly, it'll sink in on both sides equally. If you haven't, flip the RAM around and try it the other way. Push firmly on both sides until the tabs come down on the RAM modules with a click and hold it in place. Then repeat in slot 2 for the other RAM stick. Now that you've got all the main components installed on the board, we might as well test for errors. Take the 24-pin connector off the power supply and insert a paperclip into the connector, shorting the green wire to a black wire next to it. This tells the power supply fan to turn on if it's outputting the correct voltage. Make sure the paperclip stays in place, plug the power supply into the wall and hit the on switch. Watch the power supply fan, and if the fan starts to spin, this means that it works. and plug in the 24-pin connector to the slot on the motherboard. This might take some effort, but you'll know when it's in when you hear a click and the tab clips down on the motherboard. Do the same for the 4 or 8-pin CPU connector and make sure it's inserted properly. Next, turn the power supply on. If your fans start to spin, then everything is working correctly. However, if they don't spin, don't fret just yet. It could be simply that your motherboard doesn't think you pressed the button on the case yet. In that case, refer to the front pin header pin diagram in your motherboard manual. Take note of the position of power button headers. Use a metal object such as a flathead screwdriver to shot the 2 power button pins together, and this should make your system turn on. If it doesn't after this, or turns on and emits a series of high-pitched beeps, refer to the troubleshooting section at the end of the video. Now that you've built the system outside of the case, doing the same inside the case should be a simple procedure. Next, lower the motherboard into the case so that it lines up with the I/O shield and sits on the standoffs. You should be able to see through the screw holes in the motherboard to see if they're lined up correctly. Starting at each corner, screw in the motherboard to the bottom of the case, but don't screw it down too tightly or you risk cross-threading the standoffs. Now this is done, screw down the CPU cooler and install the radiator into the front of the case. Use the long screws to secure the fan in place, sticker facing outwards. This ensures that air is being sucked from the room and being blown onto the radiator and out through the back of the case and not vice versa. Pop the front panel back on and then find the front panel connector. Use the motherboard manual to connect the correct wires to the corresponding headers on the motherboard. You can use cable ties to tie down the wires at this stage if you wish. Lower the power supply into the correct section in the case, making sure the fan is facing the mesh. Screw in the power supply using the included screws and make sure it's nice and tight. Now this is all done, it's finally time to give what's likely the most expensive item in your build some showtime. Take your graphics card and lower it into the slot, making sure that it clicks into place. Now what you're going to do here is plug in the graphics card power connectors until they click into place.